They say Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995. The obituaries listed respiratory failure. They mentioned his movies, his songs, his legendary coolness. They spoke of emphysema and old age and a life well lived. But his friends knew the truth. The man who died in that Beverly Hills bedroom wasn't Dean Martin. He was a ghost, a shell, a body that had forgotten how to live 8 years earlier. The real Dean Martin, the man who laughed, the man who loved, the man who lit up every room he walked into, died on a frozen mountainside in California. He died waiting by a telephone that wouldn't ring. He died watching helicopters that couldn't fly. He died the moment he realized his golden boy was never coming home. March 21st, 1987. That was the day the King of Cool lost his crown. That was the day the music stopped. That was the day Dean Martin began his slow, silent surrender to grief. And to understand what those 6 days did to him, you first have to understand what he lost. To the world, Dean Martin had 7 children. But anyone who knew him understood that Dino was different. Dean Paul Martin Jr., Dino to everyone who loved him, was born November 17th, 1951. He was Dean's first son with his second wife Jean, and from the moment he opened his eyes, he was everything his father dreamed a son could be. He was handsome, devastatingly handsome. He had his father's dark Italian features, his mother's elegant bone structure, and a smile that could stop traffic on Sunset Boulevard. But Dino wasn't just a pretty face riding his father's coattails. He was genuinely, remarkably talented. At 16, he formed a rock band called Dino, Desi, and Billy with Desi Arnaz Jr. They weren't a novelty act trading on famous names. They were legitimate musicians who scored actual hits, toured the country, and earned respect from people who had no reason to give it. Then Dino discovered tennis. Within 2 years, he was ranked nationally. He played at Wimbledon. Not as a celebrity guest, as a competitor. Then came acting. He starred in films like Players and television shows like Misfits of Science. Critics noted his natural screen presence, his effortless charisma. They said he had something you couldn't teach. But the thing Dino loved most, the thing that consumed him completely, was flying. He joined the California Air National Guard and earned his wings as a fighter pilot, not a weekend warrior, a real pilot flying real missions in an F-4 Phantom, one of the most demanding aircraft in the American arsenal. Dean would show people pictures of Dino in his flight suit, standing next to his jet, and his voice would crack with pride. "That's my boy," he'd say. "He flies Phantoms. I just sing songs." It wasn't false modesty. Dean genuinely believed his son had surpassed him. And in a way that brought no jealousy, only joy, he was right. The bond between Dean and Dino went deeper than father and son. Dean Martin was famous for keeping everyone at arm's length. He built walls around himself that even Frank Sinatra couldn't fully penetrate. He showed up, he performed, he went home. He didn't do Hollywood parties. He didn't do late nights with the boys. He didn't let people in. But Dino was different. With Dino, the walls came down. They played golf together every week. They had dinner together whenever Dino was in town. They talked on the phone constantly about everything and nothing, the way best friends do. Dino was the only person who saw the real Dean Martin. Not the character, not the image, the man. "Dad's different with Dino," his daughter Deanna once observed. "He laughs differently. He listens differently. It's like Dino has a key that nobody else has." That key unlocked something in Dean that the world never got to see. A vulnerability, a tenderness, a capacity for love that the King of Cool kept carefully hidden from everyone else. When Dean looked at Dino, he saw his own immortality. He saw proof that his life had meant something beyond the applause. He saw a future where the Martin name would shine not because of showbiz tricks, but because of genuine achievement. Dino was his anchor, his validation, his reason. And on March 21st, 1987, that anchor was ripped away. The day started like any other Saturday in Southern California. Clear skies over Los Angeles, temperatures in the mid-60s, a beautiful day to be alive. But 60 miles east in the San Bernardino Mountains, a monster was waking up. A freak late-season storm had descended on Mount San Gorgonio, the highest peak in Southern California. Temperatures at elevation had plummeted below zero. Visibility had dropped to nothing. Winds were howling at 60 miles per hour, whipping snow into a white wall that swallowed everything it touched. The mountain rose 11,500 feet into the sky. a wall of granite and ice that had claimed lives before and would claim lives again. Captain Dean Paul Martin and his weapons systems officer, Captain Ramon Ortiz, were scheduled for a routine training flight out of March Air Force Base. A standard instrument departure, up through the clouds, out toward the desert. They'd done it 100 times. The F-4 Phantom they were flying was a beast of an aircraft, 30 tons of metal and fuel capable of breaking the sound barrier. It had served in Vietnam. It had proven itself in combat, but on this day, no machine was capable enough. At 3:21 p.m., Dino's jet received clearance for takeoff. At 3:34 p.m., the radar controllers watched the blip representing Dino's aircraft make a left turn to avoid a building wall of clouds. At 3:36 p.m., the blip disappeared. Phantom 6, Los Angeles Center. Radio check. Static. Phantom 6, come in. Static. Phantom 6, do you read? Nothing but static. And in that static lay a nightmare that would never end. Dean Martin was at home in Beverly Hills when the phone rang. He was probably watching television. An old western, maybe. Nursing a soft drink. Never the hard stuff at home, despite what the world believed. The voice on the other end wasn't Dino. Mr. Martin, this is Colonel Richardson from the California Air National Guard. I'm calling about your son. Captain Martin's aircraft failed to arrive at its destination. We've lost radar contact. His plane is currently listed as missing. Missing. The word hung in the air like smoke. Not crashed. Not down. Missing. Missing meant there was hope. Missing meant maybe he ejected. Maybe he's sitting on a ridge somewhere, wrapped in his parachute, waiting for rescue. Maybe he's cold but alive. Maybe he's hurt but breathing. Missing meant Dean could still pray. What happened? Dean asked, his voice steady, controlled. We're not certain yet, sir. The weather in the mountains is severe. We're having difficulty getting aircraft into the search area. I'm coming to the base. Sir, there's nothing you can do here right now. I'm coming to the base. Dean hung up the phone. For a long moment, he didn't move. He stood in his living room, surrounded by the trappings of a legendary career. Gold records on the walls, photographs with presidents. None of it mattered. None of it had ever mattered. The only thing that mattered was on a mountain, somewhere in the snow, and Dean couldn't reach him. The first night was the worst. Dean drove to March Air Force Base and sat in the operations center, watching radar screens that showed nothing, listening to radio channels that carried only static. The weather was too severe for helicopters. Ground teams couldn't get within miles of the suspected crash site. Dean chain-smoked, one cigarette after another, filling the room with a blue haze. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He barely spoke. Every few minutes, someone would give him an update. Still no visual contact, Mr. Martin. Weather's not breaking, Mr. Martin. We'll try again at first light, Mr. Martin. Dean nodded at each report. Polite, controlled, the mask firmly in place. But inside he was screaming. He bargained with God. He made promises he knew he couldn't keep. He offered everything, the money, the fame, the houses, the cars, every record and every movie, in exchange for one thing. Just give me the boy, take everything else. Just give me the boy. God wasn't bargaining that night. Around midnight, Frank Sinatra arrived. He'd heard the news and come immediately, not to offer comfort, but to stand watch. That's what you did for family. Frank sat next to Dean without saying a word. Two old men who had conquered the world sitting helpless in a military operations center, watching a storm on a radar screen. He's tough, Frank finally said. If anyone could survive out there, it's Dino. Dean nodded. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. But somewhere deep in his gut, in that place where fathers know things they can't explain, Dean already sensed the truth. The mountain had taken his boy, and the mountain wasn't giving him back. Day 2. The storm continued. Winds at the summit gusted to 80 miles per hour. Rescue helicopters attempted 3 times to reach the search area. 3 times they were forced back. Dean returned to Beverly Hills but couldn't stay. The silence in the house was unbearable. Every room reminded him of Dino. The golf clubs in the closet, the photographs on the piano, the chair where Dino always sat during Sunday dinners. He went back to the base. Sammy Davis Jr. called. He wanted to fly in, but Dean told him to stay home. There's nothing to do here, Sam. Nothing but wait, Jerry Lewis called. The two men hadn't spoken much in years. Too much history, too much pain. But tragedy has a way of erasing old wounds. I'm sorry, Dean. I'm so sorry. If there's anything, I know, Jer. Thanks. Dean hung up and went back to watching the weather maps. The storm wasn't moving. The mountain was keeping it secret. Day 3, a break in the weather. Partial, temporary, but enough. At 6:47 a.m., the first helicopter lifted off from March Air Force Base. Dean was at the window, watching it disappear into the gray dawn. 2 hours later, they found the wreckage. The F-4 Phantom had impacted the granite face of San Gorgonio at approximately 400 miles per hour. The collision had been catastrophic. There was no debris field, just a scar on the mountainside and fragments of metal embedded in the rock. There was no ejection seat deployment, no parachute, no survival gear, no survivors. Captain Dean Paul Martin and Captain Ramon Ortiz had died instantly. They had probably never seen the mountain coming. In the whiteout conditions, they had simply flown into a wall of granite without any warning. The call came at 11:23 a.m. Dean answered on the first ring. "Mr. Martin, this is Colonel Richardson. We've located the crash site. There are no survivors. I'm deeply sorry, sir. Your son died serving his country." Dean listened to the words. Fine officer, fine pilot, died serving his country. Words that were supposed to mean something. They meant nothing. They were just sounds. Dean thanked the colonel. He was polite. He was gracious. He was Dean Martin. Then he hung up the phone, and the man who had made millions laugh for 40 years began to cry. Not dramatic sobs, just silent tears running down a weathered face, dripping onto carpet. He cried for his golden boy. He cried for the grandchildren he would never have. He cried for every golf game they would never play, every dinner they would never share, every phone call that would never come. He cried until there were no tears left. And then he stopped. He wiped his face. He made the calls he needed to make. But something had changed in Dean Martin's eyes. The twinkle was gone. The mischief was gone. The light that had charmed the world for 4 decades flickered once and went out. It never came back. The funeral was held on March 25, 1987, at Los Angeles National Cemetery. It was a military funeral, full honors, the flag-draped casket, the rifle salute, the haunting notes of taps echoing across the headstones. Dean Martin stood at attention through the entire service. He wore his dark glasses not to look cool, but to hide eyes that were swollen, empty, dead. Frank Sinatra stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Sammy Davis Jr. wept openly, making no attempt to hide his grief. And in the back row, almost invisible in a sea of black suits, sat Jerry Lewis. He had come alone, without announcement. He didn't approach Dean. He didn't call attention to himself. He just sat in the back row and said goodbye to a young man he had known since childhood. At one point during the service, Dean's eyes drifted across the crowd and landed on a familiar face in the back row. Jerry. Their eyes met for just a moment. 1 second, maybe 2. Dean nodded almost, imperceptibly. Jerry nodded back. No words, no embrace. Just an acknowledgement across 30 years of history, 30 years of complicated love. Sometimes the loudest apology is showing up when it matters. After the service, Dean approached the casket. He placed his hand on the flag and leaned close. Nobody knows what he whispered. Maybe, "I love you." Maybe, "Wait for me." Then Dean Martin put his dark glasses back on and walked away from his son's grave. He never fully returned. In the weeks after the funeral, Dean retreated into his Beverly Hills home and closed the gates. He stopped returning phone calls. He stopped going to dinner. He stopped playing golf. He stopped doing everything that had once given him pleasure. The house became a mausoleum, silent, dark, frozen in time. Dean would sit in his favorite chair for hours, staring at nothing. The television played constantly, old westerns mostly, but Dean wasn't really watching. He was somewhere else, somewhere on a frozen mountain. Friends tried to reach him. Frank called every day. They invited him to dinner, to shows, to anything that might draw him out. Dean always declined. "I'm tired, maybe next time." But there was never a next time. A year after Dino's death, Frank Sinatra hatched a plan. The Together Again tour, Frank, Dean, and Sammy. The Rat Pack reunited. Stadiums across America. Frank thought the applause would heal Dean. He thought the music would bring him back to life. He was wrong. The tour launched in March 1988. Oakland, Vancouver, Chicago. Sold-out crowds. But something was wrong. Dean stood on stage and looked lost. He forgot lyrics. He missed cues. He flicked cigarette ashes onto the stage floor with a look of utter contempt. The magic was gone. All of it had died on that mountain with Dino. In Chicago, on the 5th night of the tour, Dean reached his breaking point. He turned to Frank backstage with exhausted eyes. "I can't do this. Anymore." Frank put a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Pally, one more show. For me." Dean shook his head. "I want to go home, Frank." Something in his voice stopped Frank cold. This wasn't stage fright. This was a man who had reached the end of his rope. Dean Martin walked out of the arena that night. He flew back to Los Angeles. He never performed again. The final 7 years of Dean Martin's life were a study in solitude. He established a simple routine. Every evening he would put on a sports coat, always dressed properly, and drive to his favorite Italian restaurant, La Famiglia. He would sit at the same table. They would bring him his pasta fagioli, his wine. And often, Dean would ask them to set a place at the empty chair across from him. That empty chair was for Dino. Dean was having dinner with his son. He would sit for hours, occasionally speaking to the empty chair. Waiters would overhear fragments. "You would have loved this pasta." "I miss you, boy." It was heartbreaking to witness. This legendary entertainer reduced to a lonely old man talking to a ghost. He told a friend once near the end, "I'm not afraid of dying. Why should I be? Everyone I love is already there." Christmas Day, 1995. The world was celebrating. Presents were being opened. Children were laughing. Dean Martin lay in his bed at 511 North Mapleton Drive. His breathing was shallow. The emphysema had ravaged his lungs. But it wasn't his lungs that were giving out. It was his will. He was 78 years old. He had outlived Sammy. He had outlived his son by 8 years. Each one of those days had been borrowed time. Now, finally, the sentence was over. Dean Martin closed his eyes on Christmas morning. There was no struggle, just a gentle exhale, and then silence. The King of Cool was gone. When the news broke, Las Vegas did something it had done only once before. The lights on the Strip went dark. Every casino, every hotel, every neon sign. For 3 minutes, the most famous street in America went completely black. 3 minutes of darkness to honor a man who had helped make those lights shine. Frank Sinatra wept when he heard the news. Dean was the best friend a man could have, and the world is emptier without him. Dean was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park, not far from his beloved Dino. His tombstone bears a simple inscription: "Everybody loves somebody sometime." They say Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. But his friends knew the truth. Dean Martin died on March 21, 1987, on a frozen mountainside in California. He died waiting by a phone. He died when a voice said, "No survivors." He died when he realized his golden boy was never coming home. What walked the earth for the next 8 years was something else. A ghost, a body going through motions while the soul had already departed. Dean Martin spent 40 years making the world laugh. He wore the mask of the King of Cool. He pretended that nothing could touch him. But one thing touched him: his son. And when that son was taken, all the walls in the world couldn't protect him. So here's the lesson buried in this tragedy. Fame means nothing. Money means nothing. Awards and accolades mean nothing. The only thing that truly matters is love. Dean Martin loved his son so completely that he couldn't survive without him. And that love, that devastating, beautiful love, is the truest thing we'll ever know about the man behind the microphone. The next time you hear, "That's amore," don't just hear the jokes. Listen to the voice. Listen to the warmth. And remember the father who spent his final years setting a place at an empty table, having dinner with a ghost, waiting for the day he could finally go home. Rest in peace, Dino. You finally got your wings, and somewhere, on the other side of that long silence, your father is waiting for you. That's the King of Cool. That's Dean Martin, and that's a love. Story that will echo through eternity.